Welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Recently, the European Parliament voted to refuse China market economy status, saying that China has not fulfilled the EU's 5 criteria. However, China will automatically transit to a market economy status for Europe by the end of this year under the agreement signed when China joined the World Trade Organization in the year 2001. What impact will the resolution bring to China-EU relations? What are the underlying reasons behind the debate over China's market economy status? To discuss all these issues, I'm happy to be joined by John Rouse, He Wen, the two gentlemen. They are both from Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University. Before getting started, let's have a look at this.
546 votes in favor and 28 against, the European Parliament urging the EU not to grant China a market economy status. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. Under the protocols covering the country's accession, China's status should automatically transit to that of a market economy for Europe by December 11th this year. But many EU lawmakers say China fails to meet the 5 criteria defining a market economy. However, simply by browsing through the list of countries that the EU has already recognized as market economies, it appears the same standards have not always been applied in EU decisions to grant the status. Another reason the EU lawmakers are refusing to recognize China as a market economy is that they fear such an endorsement would harm certain industries within the bloc, especially in southern European countries where steel, textile, and other manufacturing sectors have been hard hit. More competitive manufacturing countries, such as the UK and the Netherlands, have voiced their support for granting China the status. The non-market economy status of China has often become a convenient weapon for trade protectionists. Bilateral trade between China and the EU has been growing quickly despite the lower level status. China is now the EU's second largest trading partner, with daily trade surpassing $1 million. As many experts have pointed out, in the long run, the EU has more to gain than lose by designating China as a market economy.
Welcome to the discussion here, gentlemen. Now, Jiang and Wei Wen, does China really need the recognition from the European Union about our so-called market economy status?
Well, no, from a legal point of view, it doesn't, because it becomes into force in December. Obviously, what is being played is some sort of political game in order to make protests. My actual view is it's political game to divert attention away from the real problems which exist inside Europe. I mean, the basic approach in Europe seems to be that those who don't have power are the cause of the problem. So we have Romanian refugees are the cause of the problem. Now China is the cause of the problem. Whoever is not responsible is the people who are actually running the country. So I think it's really a political diversion.
Well, John sounds a little bit cynical. What do you think? Do you agree with him?
Yes, I do, certainly. But I should add something. China does not care that much whether the European Union grants China market economy status, because whether China is a market economy is not decided by European Union nor by United States, but judged by WTO assessment on China's trading refugee every 3 years. Their conclusion was positive each time. So what we can very much is the substitute country methodology in the case of anti-dumping and decountervailing cases should stop immediately on December the 11th this year.
Professor He Wen sounds like a protest. But by the end of this year, China will automatically transit to a market economy status. Do you think the European Union will accept this regulation that's implied in the WTO commitment that we signed 15 years ago?
The European Union will not go against what the WTO decides. It'll accept that. I mean, the WTO is too fundamental from the point of the world trading structure. As I say, this is rather, in my opinion, a political game rather than a serious one. It can, of course, have some negative consequences if the situation gets out of control. Part of the problems in Europe at the present time is you have the rise of some rather unpleasant populist forces that don't act terribly rationally, quite honestly, in a number of countries. And this can create some political problems, but the fundamental structure of the European Union will not defy what the WTO decides, no.
what countermeasures are likely to be taken by China in response to the announcement by the European Parliament to reject China this market economy status?
It's too early to say China will stage any countermeasures.
Do you think China will retaliate?
Well, of course, we are unhappy. We will say we are unhappy. We are against you, against this decision. You should say that China is a market economy. But next stage, we should do some work carefully. We should not only deal with the European Union, not only the leading European Union countries like Germany, Britain, and France, but also deal with the leading industry associations and they cooperate with them, especially the steel sector, try to seek win-win so as to lay good foundations for future.
I'm wondering aloud whether there are differences between, for example, European Parliament, the EU Commission, and whatever organizations in Brussels, because we have some kind of overlapping mechanisms, don't we, when we examine the functions of the EU, when, as you said a few minutes earlier, when the EU is facing so many problems of their own.
Well, certainly the European Parliament knows that their vote doesn't mean anything. It has no power. They could pass a resolution.
Excuse me, it doesn't have power?
It has no power of decision of whether China is recognized as market status in the economy.
But the Europeans are proud of a proposal. Yeah, they send their representatives
but
and
it's
members of
not
Parliament.
decided by that. The European Parliament has no serious power at all. The real
See, this
power,
guy comes from the UK, which will vote for their future with continental Europe in July. So he's not very serious about the
John
European
stands
Union.
firmly for remaining.
I'm totally.
What's your personal position?
I've got two personal positions. One is I am in favour of Britain remaining within the EU.
Oh, so you'll take side with President Obama?
No, I take sides in what's in the interests of Britain. That's what I take it in the interests of, not President Obama, right? Secondly, Britain will vote to remain within the European Union. That's going to be the outcome. It's simple. That's a diversion. What takes place what you have to do is look at the real situation, not what people make claims about. The European Parliament could have voted unanimously to deny China market status, and it knows it has no legal power over this issue, whatever. So it's a farce. The whole thing is a certain farce. But if the European Union has the biggest anti-market, probably, policy in the entire world, which is the European Common Agricultural Policy, which subsidises tens of millions of people and spreads underdevelopment through its effect on agricultural prices throughout the world. If you want to have a serious judgment about what the market economy is, the European Union is certainly not one.
The use of a farce may sound a little bit too cynical, if not emotional. What impact will this resolution produce on the prospective relationship between China and the European Union? Because many from China say this is, after all, a result of a trade protectionism in times of economic crisis. After all, the European Union does not perform very well economically, and therefore there is the rebound of populism for politics in individual EU member states.
I think we could make that conclusion because it's too simple just to say that it shows the protectionism in Europe. We just say that what we care most is whether European Union will accept and perform the suspension and the drop of substitute country methodology. If European Union does follow in the WTO protocol, then that's okay. That will not affect that much China-EU trade. If it does not, and it adopt a new substitute country or SCM 2.0, a new version, that will jeopardize the trade very much.
China has surpassed Germany to be the biggest producer of solar panels, and we're going to use green technology to replace dirty fossil fuels such as coal. Having said this, by the end of the day, many who are very skeptical about the anti-dumping measures, for example, the European Union, the European Parliament, so to speak, cites the 5 criteria to punish China without giving China the status. They say They say in southern European countries where steel, textile and other manufacturing sectors have been hard hit, there is this matter of trade protectionism.
Well, yes, I am. There's a second aspect to what I call farce, which I feel very concerned about as somebody who's in Britain, right, which is the problem you have with, for example, the British steel industry or European industry in general is its lack of investment. You have had decades of inadequate industrial policies, lack of investment, and a significant number of people are now threatened with loss of their jobs. Not loss of their jobs due to China. They're being told something which is not true. They're due to loss of jobs of the failure of the economic policies in Europe and lack of investment and the very negative effects of the austerity policies. And people in Europe are suffering as a result of that. And obviously, as I'm European, I feel considerably concerned about this matter. That is why the whole thing is deeply damaging, not merely from the point of view of China, it's damaging also from the point of the interest of the population of Europe. They should be addressing the real problems which exist in Europe, which are the slow growth, the lack of investment, the austerity policies which have created great social tension. These are the real problems in Europe, not China.
The socialist governments in Paris, France, seem to have angered those who took to the street in protest against the regulations that may compromise the labor rights there. What do you think of the anger that may have fueled the populism in not only Europe but also in the United States, where we see the rise of Donald Trump, who takes advantage of populism and public anger?
I think there are two different stories. In the United States, Donald Trump bases his slogans on many wishes of the poor people or the lower middle class who haven't seen their incomes rising over the past 30 years. In France, it's quite different because those people are used to staying with good benefits without doing much. So they refuse to any change.
John, on Monday, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi slammed the European Parliament resolution refusing to grant China market economy status, saying the move was not constructive. What do you think of Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's remarks? Is that a kind of a warning?
Well, I'm not going to take them as a warning. I take it as a statement of fact. This is bound to have negative consequences. I'm not going to give advice to China on what it should do, because I would have to have many more facts available in order to do so, apart from the fact that I'm not Chinese, right? But what is perfectly clear is China is, together with the United States, the greatest trading partners for Europe. If there is some sort of trade war stumbled into between China and the European Union, this will be negative for the people inside Europe. So I don't think he was making a threat, I just think he was stating the real situation. You can't avoid these facts. China is a great economic power. There are great benefits. For example, in Eastern Europe, I was just in fact writing an article about this this week. You suddenly have a great interest in China in Eastern Europe. Why? Because the West European economies are growing very slowly, and therefore you have President Xi Jinping is visiting first state visit to the Czech Republic. We have the Polish foreign minister coming to China because they want to look after the interests of their countries. I think China's foreign minister was just stating the real situation.
You seem to suggest that the European Union is likely to fall apart given the impact of the refugee crisis.
No, I don't.
You don't think so?
No, the European Union has some problems.
And you don't
it
think
has slow growth.
You don't think the British departure from continental Europe will produce a serious impact?
It's not going to depart. let us discuss.
Well, you have your bias.
Let us discuss Yang Rui on the day after the referendum. And
I refuse to be held hostage by your personal bias.
I'm not personal bias. Let's discuss the day after the referendum. I mean, have me back on the programme and we'll discuss it, and my view will be confirmed.
Well, thank you very much. You're watching Dialogue with John Ross and He Wei Wen. We're discussing why the European Parliament decides not to grant us the economic market economy status, although by the end of this year, China will automatically transit to such a status, according to the regulations of the WTO. Whether the European Union will follow the regulations, we'll come back to examine and discuss this after the short break. Welcome back, gentlemen. One of the major topics in the MES debate is the fear of job losses in Europe's less competitive manufacturing industries. So that takes me back to what happened exactly 15 years ago when our entry into the WTO led to the burning of one of the shoe shops in Madrid. local anger led to, the sabotage of the Chinese shops there, because our cheap textiles and shoes in particular started to inundate their market, while all the quotas started to be phased out immediately. Now, what do you think of the possibility that more of the Europeans will be made redundant? They will lose their jobs because of our very strong competitive edge for the manufacturing industry?
Yes, let's go back to that case in Spain, 2003 or 2004. Should be sometime around that. But nothing happened later because we changed that. We worked together with the local Spanish manufacturers and changed our attitude. So such a thing passed. So in the case today, in the steel industry, yes, the European steel industry is in a big trouble. But you should not ascribe all the reasons to China. And China should also seek to work with the European steel industry for a win-win. A few years ago, we succeeded in cooperation in the photovoltaic case. Why not with steel industry?
John, in fact, China is the only and the first non-EU country which has generously committed to invest in the EU's young plan, quote-unquote. It's a 315 billion euros investment plan to kickstart Europe's economy. Now, if the EU refuses to grant China MES finally, what impact will that bring to China's engagement in the Juncker plan? Will that also threaten the ongoing negotiations for the bilateral investment treaty and an FTA between China and the European Union?
Well, I'm not going to judge what China should do in the situation. It depends on very, very many factors in the situation. I'm not going to deal with that. But the general situation is very clear. The big problem in Europe is lack of investment. Lack of investment in infrastructure, lack of investment in the steel industry, etc. And that's been a problem for some decades. That is what is really the causes of the problem and situation in Europe. It needs a lot of investment, and China is one of the sources of that investment. All I can say is if Europe does not want to give market economy status, it will make it more difficult for China to participate and less inclined to participate. That's inevitable. What it will decide to do will be taken in the light of many other factors, but it will lead to worse relations. And this is the big problem, because this is what, to save the jobs of people in Europe, it needs that investment. That's the real future for them. They are not going to be able to compete with China's wages levels. The wages are rising satisfactorily in China, but it will take decades, I'm afraid, for Chinese wages to reach European levels. They can't compete on that. They need high infrastructure, they need high technology, and they need serious investment, and the Juncker plan provides part of that.
Wei-Wen, it seems that your sophistication suggests clearly that there's no need for China to display our anger this year. Will automatically become such a market economy status, and therefore we should still encourage Chinese tourists to go there, doing shopping, take it easy, having fun, instead of displaying our displeasure.
Well, I should explain that there's no such a thing that China will be granted automatically market economy status by the end of this year, because there's no such a clause in China's protocol in accession to WTO. It only refers to the anti-dumping. Mm-hmm. So the substitute country methodology must stop ever since December the 11th, or 15 years after China's accession. So it's regarding to anti-dumping only, to market economic status in sectors, not macro level economies. So what we care is whether the substitute country methodology will continue. If it does, then there will be terrible problems. If it does not, following the protocol, then there will be okay. As far as the investment is concerned, of course they are related. I quite agree with John. Still, I should add that investment is something different from the anti-dumping cases. For instance, take the United States, for example. The United States has made clear, very clear, all the time that it will not admit China as a market economy status. Still, China-U.S. bilateral investment treaty is going on. The talks, negotiations are going on, and will continue to grow.
Yes, the issue of BIT is well underway between the two sides. Perhaps for the next round of strategic and economic dialogue across the Pacific Ocean. Having said this, Long Yongtu, the chief negotiator of the Chinese delegation, who had been involved in all the negotiations about China's entry into the WTO, said, upon hearing the European Parliament decision, that there's no such a thing like a market economy status in the world, because almost in all major economies you have the issue of subsidies, agriculture subsidies in the in the United States, for example. Therefore, we have nothing to fear but the fear itself. Don't get obsessively concerned about the issue of market economy status. Do you think what he says has some ring of truth?
Yes, absolutely. As I already said, the subsidies, if there are subsidies which go to the Chinese steel industry, are tiny compared to the subsidies which go to European farmers. I mean, the Common Agricultural Policy is one of the most protective policies in the whole world. And incidentally, it has terrible consequences in the world, because the dumping which then takes place as a result of European agricultural products on the world puts tens of millions of farmers in Africa and developing countries off their land. It has fearful consequences, much more serious on a world scale than the consequences of anything which can conceivably happen in the Chinese steel industry. And this is why we should be addressing the real question of how to keep the jobs for people in Britain through real questions, not engaging in a silly discussion about market status, in which the European Union has no better case, frankly, than China to be considered a market economy. We should be looking at the real question. The real question is that wages are much higher in Europe than they are in China, and they're going to remain much higher for a very long time. Unfortunately for China, I wish it were otherwise, but that's the reality. This means that the workers in Europe have to have much higher investment in order to guarantee their productivity than those in China. That's the real problem, and it's been done great damage by the austerity policies. The only thing I would say is China, I hope, will reflect upon this, because I've been having an argument in China who they thought that the problem in Europe was austerity, but was that they didn't have enough austerity. But the austerity policies have now done great damage now, also in creating this background against which you have anti-China feelings. So I hope there'll be a bit of reflection about that in China as well.
As China has entered into the middle income ranking, allegedly, there's an early warning from the Chinese policymakers that it will be wrong, if not a suicide, for China to learn from the European Union, in that we should raise the salaries of the workers and to inspire our workers with welfare social security programs. That will seriously undermine the competitive edge of the Chinese enterprises. Do you agree?
We should say that the salaries and the benefits of the workers and the average people must be improved year by year. But
Minister Liu Jiwei has complained many times that it's wrong to approve the labor contract law so early. That has added to the burden of enterprises, particularly employers of small and medium-sized enterprises.
I don't think it's the labor law itself, but how you stipulate in the law. Of course, the improvement of wages and the benefits of workers is justified. Still, there's a precondition that the output growth should be higher than the benefit growth, or resulting in the growth of productivity. If the output grows by 10% and the salary grows by 5%, you still have a labor productivity growing by 5%. That's okay. If the output grows only by 8% and the salary grows by 10%, that's a reduce of productivity. That's worse. That's bad.
Now, John, Russia did not join the WTO until 2012, but the EU granted market economy status to Russia in 2002. If the European Parliament really cares about these criteria, 5 of them in the case of China, why did the EU grant the status to Russia in 2002 when it is normally reserved exclusively for WTO members?
Well, because it's again part of the political game. This whole market status is not being played out as an objective political fact. It's been played out as a political game. In 2002, the European Union wanted to have very good relations with Russia because Russia is an extremely important supplier of oil, gas, raw materials to Russia. Then there was a big crisis in the Ukraine, over different matters. And if the vote was taken now on the question of whether Russia would have market status, the vote would have gone the other way. It's what I said at the beginning. What is taking place here is a political game that's being played. But the problem is that both in Europe and China, hundreds of thousands of people, in fact, if you take it all together, millions of jobs are at stake. That's why I'm against the political game. We should be addressing the real serious economic issues.
China does have its own problems with regard to the status of the market economy. For example, what about the controversial reform of the SOE? Has it come to a standstill?
No, I don't think so. The SOE reform is still going on. I have to say that the essence of the reform should be putting SOEs on an equal footing, competing with private enterprises and the foreign enterprise without too much government protection, without too much monopoly. That is the key for the reform. Not necessarily the mixed ownership, but because a mixed ownership is good, still it doesn't mean anything more than that.
What do you think of this idea that we need to do more to level the playing field between the SOE, the small and medium-sized enterprises of the non-public sector, as well as the foreign-funded enterprises? Most of them are considering perhaps relocating their R&D from China, which sees the rise of labor costs, to other low-income economies in the neighborhood of Asia.
Well, firstly, they're not actually. Actually, last year China had the biggest investment in the world. People always talk. They say costs are very high. We want a tax break. We want a tax break. But by what they say, judged by what they do, and they continue to pour money into China. That's the reality about that situation. Secondly, my views about the economy is it depends upon the competitive structure of the industries. The particular industry. Some industries are just monopolies, like the electricity grid or a metro system. It should be in the hands of the state. 150 years of experience show that it is impossible to control private monopolies. Other sectors are completely competitive, restaurants, supermarkets, etc., and the state should keep out. And there are then what are called monopolies. That's where you have 3 or 4 large companies competing. The private companies have some advantages. The state-advantaged companies have some advantages. There's no question of economic theory which tells you which is going to be more effective, so they should just compete. So you can't have a rule for the whole economy. It depends about what is the competitive or lack of competitive structure of the particular industry.
I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.